Hey, you. Yeah, you. You haven't seen Transformers One yet? What are you doing? Get a load of this guy, eh? If you're asleep on Transformers One, then wake the f up. Transformers One is an absolute banger. Finally, a Transformers movie purely focused on them, and not a bunch of humans thrown in the mix, detracting from their story. And I say that as someone who actually likes the first 3 Transformers movies. And Bumblebee was actually pretty good. But all I wanted was a Transformers movie purely focused on them while they're on Cybertron. And here we are. I took my little brothers to see this movie, and we had a blast. Without spoiling it, the plot for this movie is pretty simple, and it's very predictable, but that's the point. We know Optimus Prime has to rise and become the stoic, selfless leader of the Autobots, and we know that Megatron has to fall from grace and become the treacherous, grimy leader of the Decepticons. So this movie just makes a great origin story of that. It knows we know what's coming, so it does a fantastic job at building the brotherhood between the two. It does that so well so we could really feel it when they're put on their opposing destined paths. I really didn't expect to be so invested in the brotherhood between Megatron and Optimus. Seeing those two really feel like they need each other. Then their ideals divide them, testing the limits of their brotherhood. Good shit. I remember when the first trailer came out and not being totally sold on this movie, it just seemed really lighthearted and like a kids movie. You know what I mean. There's kids movies that adults can enjoy too, and there's kids movies that adults can fall asleep to while their kids watch. I went in thinking it was the latter, but I really like Transformers and I was taking my little brothers to this, so I wasn't really tripping. But to my surprise, this movie's a lot more mature than I thought. As the movie goes along and we start to see D16 get flares of Megatron, it gets a little darker. At first, I was like, okay, this is enjoyable, but it's still pretty kid friendly. But then D16 starts talking about putting people in chains and murder. I was like, okay, they're really committing to Megatron being really evil. Then I was locked in. And that's when my little brother locked in too. My youngest brother kept asking him questions about the movie and he would begrudgingly answer. But when we got to the third act, he told him to shut up because he was trying to watch the movie. That boy was absolutely locked. I've never seen him that focused on a movie. But despite not being fully sold by the trailer, the main reason I was looking forward to this movie is because the animation and art style are so captivating and beautiful. There are quite a few shots where I was just like, wow. I was thoroughly impressed with the cinematography in this movie. There are a couple shots in the trailer that showcases the great visuals, but I was not ready for how good this movie looks. And the fluidity of the action is just chef's kiss. I would say it does take a bit to get to the robot on robot action, but when it does get to robots eviscerating each other, it's so clean. This movie's third act is just nuts to butts robot action, and I genuinely loved it. A couple of other things that surprised me about this movie were the voice acting and the comedy. More so the voice acting, but the comedy surprisingly funny. I didn't expect to laugh as much as I did. The trailer really made me feel like I wasn't gonna enjoy it, with Bumblebee calling himself Badassatron.
The one I'm floating right now is Badassatron, which is actually pronounced Badassatron.
And going on about his knife hands.
With this guy, knife hands? I have knife hands!
I can see that.
But there are a couple gags that I genuinely laughed at. The Bumblebee-like comedy isn't necessarily bad. My little brothers were laughing, but personally, it just wasn't my cup of tea. But hey, if the kids like it, then it's whatever. I was thoroughly impressed by the voice acting though. I'm not the biggest fan of A-list actors getting cast in animated stuff over, like actual voice actors, but sometimes it really works. When I heard Chris Hemsworth was gonna be Optimus Prime, I was cautiously curious on how he would sound, especially coming off the goated performance of Peter Cullen. But Chris Hemsworth, he was actually pretty great as Optimus. He really sells the more inexperienced Orion Pax. And he cranks it up a notch as Orion transitions into Optimus Prime. He puts a bit more bass in his voice that's super fitting for this not yet veteran Optimus Prime. One that's just now stepping into his role of leadership. But man, Brian Tyree Henry really steals the show as D16/Megatron. I was already a fan of his voice acting after the Spider-Verse movies. He's just so amazing as Miles' dad. Just the inflections and cadence in his voice is just so good. I will say, I do prefer a more monstrous voice for Megatron, like in the Bay movies and some of the cartoons. But when Brian Tyree Henry goes into full speech mode, I can't help but be locked into his performance. He had me wanting to join the Decepticons and fight for him. No cap. The rest of the A-list cast are pretty great too. Scarlett Johansson as Alita 1 is surprisingly good. John Hamm as Sentinel Prime is pretty great. Just the perfect voice for the self-absorbed asshole that Sentinel Prime is. Lawrence Fishburne delivered that gravitas for Alpha Trion, and even though the character is kind of annoying, Keegan-Michael Key is fitting for Bumblebee. I know I didn't list everyone, but those are the ones that stuck out in my head a week plus from seeing this movie. But even the people I didn't mention did a great job. But the one that was off-rip my favorite without even hearing it in action was Steve Buscemi as Starscream. I've always loved that little sniveling, conniving bastard. I just knew that Steve Buscemi was gonna knock it out of the park as Starscream, and he did. He's so perfect for him. Now this movie isn't perfect. I do think D16's turn to Megatron could have been handled a bit better. It was absolutely fire when he does make that switch and we see him go down the path to become a Decepticon. But I feel like more seeds could have been planted from the start. Because when he does flip that switch, it feels like it comes out of nowhere, at least to me. It just doesn't feel like he had that fire and drive to actually become a ruthless leader like Megatron. But man, I still loved Megatron so much in this movie. Him really embracing his role is so damn good, and the visuals that go along with it, man. But like I said earlier, this movie does take a bit to get to the robot on robot action. I wish it was sprinkled in a little bit more, but the third act really saves it. Because it is really non-stop action, it just takes a little bit to get there. The comedy, like I said, is a bit hit or miss for me, but there are some actual funny bits that made me laugh out loud, so it's not too bad. My problems didn't really detract for how much I enjoyed this, because even with them, I still enjoyed this movie from start to finish. I was gonna go watch Joker 2, but I think I'm just gonna watch this again or go see The Wild Robot. But I made this video because it sucks not seeing this movie do too great, and that's for various reasons. The marketing is kinda ass. The first trailer really did not do this movie justice at all. It had a lot of people instantly turned off by it. And if I wasn't a Transformers fan, I would have wrote it off too. I don't know about the other trailers, because if I know I'm gonna see a movie, then I don't need to see a bunch of other trailers spoiling scenes. But with the first one I did see, you really don't get any of the darker undertones of this movie. And it really doesn't showcase how great the action is. And what's also going against this movie is it wasn't released worldwide at the same time. On top of all that, it was supposedly pulled from like 900 theaters in the US, most likely stemming from its poor performance. I just hate seeing a great animated movie like this doing so poorly. And it being a Transformers movie that I actually loved after all the stinkers in the Bayverse, it's just an all-around sad case. It also doesn't help that this movie's probably going to be on streaming fairly soon and not get time to breathe in the theaters like most movies these days. I just hope this movie does well enough to get a sequel, or at least get carried by toy sales. Because the stuff that this movie sets up is so good, I need to see this all play out. The minor problems I did have with this movie, I see getting ironed out in the next film. It's gonna be all out war. But yeah, if you haven't seen this movie, and you can, go see it in theaters and support it. I need the sequel to this movie, man. And if I don't get the sequel, I'll be in your walls. Jokes, jokes. But nah, not really. I'll really be in your walls. But per usual, when something I enjoy drops, I get hyper fixated on it, and now I'm feeding for some more Transformers stuff. There's this 3-minute Transformers anime opening by Studio Trigger for Transformers 40th anniversary, and I've been meaning to check it out, so I'm gonna do that. I'm not a super fan of Transformers and know all their lore, but they're giant talking robots who fight each other. So yeah, they're pretty cool. They just scratch that kid part of my brain, but there's deeper themes about the tragedy of war and whatnot that adult me could get attached to. So my eyes are really on the Transformers comics. I've been hearing they're actually pretty good for a while now. I know the lore runs pretty deep from what I see on Twitter, and I want to get more into it. So now that I'm finally getting deep into comics, I want to dive deep into the Transformers lore. So drop your recommended Transformers comics in the comments so I can check them out. And I'd also like to know what you guys thought of Transformers One down below. Don't forget to drop a like and subscribe for more future bangers. But that's pretty much it. Twos.